Hey, it's creating creative chaos again. This is episode 14. Damn, I'm really cranking these suckers out. Yeah, so I started off today with a leaf blower outside my window. So yeah, I got to tell you, man, humans, we invent a lot of stuff, but the leaf blower, the sound of a leaf blower has got to be one of the most freaking annoying things out there. It's like grinding. But I tested it, and you guys shouldn't be able to hear it through through the podcast. In which case, maybe if you can, it'll be the most annoying podcast you've ever heard. Um, but that aside, yeah, I did want to like talk a little bit about something I was mentioning at the end of the last episode. And that was basically the kind of healthy contempt I have for elites and large bureaucracies. And I do want to clarify. I think you're always going to have elites. We're not ants. I mean, we're kind of physiologically developed. Um, I don't know, to have a hierarchy of some sort. And, bureaucracies in and of themselves aren't bad either because, any sort of complicated society is going to have those. It's how you can do things like, build pyramids and, whatever. Um, but I think the problem, and this is what kind of grinds my gizzard, so to speak, is that, it's when they don't they have no turnover. They're kind of like self-insulating, and they tend to that. If you have like an elite that makes it exceedingly hard for anybody else to get into the elite, they kind of create these little insular worlds, and that's where I think the problem is. So if you're gonna have an elite, definitely make sure you've got some churn in there, some turnover. Um, I don't know, practically speaking, one of the easiest ways, just make an inheritance tax like 99%, or do like what Warren Buffett did, where you can only leave your kids like $1 million, which is still a huge advantage, but you're not going to get things where like somebody can have billions of dollars to waste and isolate themselves. Um, and then also make sure that, people that don't have that, people that grow up poor have as many advantages as those that grow up rich, great education system, stuff like that. Just kind of no brainer. So that, so you have a meritocracy rather than an oligarchy. And with bureaucracies, I mean, holy crap, dude, you know, make sure with turnover with that periodically, and I'm talking, I don't know how often you'd want to do this, every couple of years or something, have like outside people come through and see what everybody's doing and make sure that they're actually, not just generating PowerPoints for meetings and are actually doing something, and then regular, making them transparent and then, I mean, I know there's problems with the statistics. You can fake those things, but somebody's not, it's easier to get somebody when they're faking statistics than if they're not taking statistics at all. So, some way that you can actually refer back to make sure that they're earning their paycheck. I don't know, it's kind of an aside. Um, just to clarify what I was talking about at the end of the last chapter. So this is chapter 8. This is where our heroes actually go down to the kingdom, which has gone off the rails with the king dying, and now there's a civil war going on. So our hero and Minrir and Kells and the sheepish militia are going down to sort things out. And so yeah, let me go ahead and share my screen and we can talk about that. Okay. Chapter 8. We get things sorted. Remember at the end of the last chapter, it's where they were alerted to the problems that were happening, that there's a civil war going on. And then at the very end, Cyrene sends a little terse letter telling him to get off his ass and get down there and help her get things sorted out. So here he is. We made good time down the trade road, the sheepish and the house guard marching along in relative silence, the only sounds being muttered conversations, the tramp of leather boots, and the jingle of harness. The supply wagons, pulled by ill-tempered mules who I suspected could trace their lineage back to moose, easily kept up, and late afternoon the entire army would stop and make a fortified camp. The march was blessedly boring and the weather clear until we reached the borders of sheepland. After that, things got a tad messy. First, we noticed the potholes. The trade road obviously wasn't being maintained up to its usual low standards, but this didn't overly inconvenience us because the sheepish amused themselves by indulging in road repair as they passed. And then we noticed the ruins. It seemed like the participants in this war had decided the way to prove that they were the best choice for running the kingdom was to burn it, which they did with great enthusiasm to every farmstead, roadside inn, and hamlet they could find. Now, this seemed rather short sighted to me, but then again, this was only my second war, so perhaps I was missing something? As I sat on Moose, surveying the smoking ruins of a particularly large farm, I wondered what these geniuses thought they were going to eat come winter. Clearly, long term planning for things like this wasn't a priority for my erstwhile opponents. We didn't see many people, at least initially, but once we got closer to Admini, we started encountering the pacifists. Now, you may think that current events wouldn't lend themselves to nonviolence, and I would tend to agree. But whenever we encountered these small bands lurking near the road, I would send Moose, Minrir, and Kells to go round them up and see what they were up to. And then once they'd done that and brought them to me, these gentle and harmless folk, once they caught sight of us, Minrir especially, they inevitably began loudly declaring their peaceable intentions and harmlessness to all within earshot. I was a bit skeptical of their claims, regardless of how passionately they professed them, because they were always well armed, with an excess of gold, jewelry stashed in their camps. I didn't think gentle folk who so passionately professed to love peace, love, and harmony would be inclined to festoon themselves with so many weapons. But it wasn't for us to ponder whether a tool incites violence or simply provides the means for those who wish to commit violence. So we disarmed those we met and sent them on their way after a Kells pep talk. I never found out exactly what she said, but it always left them pale and shaking, and we didn't have any trouble from these groups afterwards. This became something my army was quite proficient at, spreading pacifism. I guess in thinking back on it, I don't know if this is clear enough, but essentially they're running into bands of supposed pacifists beside the road, but they're only pacifists once they catch sight of Minrir, which is something I think we can relate to in the real world with this. Anyway, going on. Our merry band didn't encounter any substantial resistance until we reached Kettersbad, the first major city on our way to Admini. The smell emanating from the city clearly indicated that there were a lot of people crammed within its walls, and that they just as clearly thought that maintaining a functioning sewer system wasn't worth the trouble. As we approached, we could see the walls were crowded with soldiers, bristling with spears and other sharp implements of pacifism. There were 6 different flags flying from the ramparts, so it wasn't exactly clear who was holding Kettersbad, but what was clear was that they didn't mean to let us pass unchallenged. But despite all this, I wasn't too worried, because if there's one thing I've learned over the years, is that you can always gauge how well run a particular settlement is by seeing, or in this case smelling, how well maintained its sewers are. And the reason for this is that sewers are expensive. They tend to smell awful even when they're working as intended, and they're hardly awe-inspiring even when they're architectural masterpieces. In other words, they don't particularly lend themselves to the high-profile, flashy programs that are so near and dear to incompetent leaders. Given the choice between building a new temple, for example, or a new sewer system, they will inevitably choose the temple, even when raw sewage is running through their streets. I mean, when's the last time you saw a highly ranked leader proudly presiding over a new sewer opening? I rest my case. Kettersbad smelt so foul that it was obvious that whoever was in charge had no idea what they were doing, so I seriously doubted that they'd had the foresight to stockpile provisions for an extended siege. I decided to rest my army for a week or so, just long enough for the garrison to realize they didn't have enough food and to begin considering the benefits of pacifism, assuming, of course, that diseases didn't start killing them off first. So we made camp and sent the obligatory expendable herald to the walls, in this case, one of the pacifists we'd encountered along the road. He was promptly pincushioned with arrows, which we took as a sign that the forces holding the city wanted to do this the hard way. So then we settled in to wait them out. Of course, we weren't idle during this time, the sheepish being who they are, and within a few days we had a rather nice ram and several fashionably hide-armored siege towers ready to go in case we needed to speed things along. All in all, it was a pleasant interlude, and really the only difficulty we had was in staying upwind from Kettersbad, which was olfactorily going from bad to worse. Early the next week, several starving and sickly representatives from the various armed factions inside staggered out of a postern gate to ask for terms. In short order, I had them all disarmed and digging latrines outside the walls, while inside the city, the ruling council, who had been arrested and imprisoned by these geniuses, got back to the business of unstopping the sewers, cleaning up the water supply, and restocking their granaries. And that was how the famous siege of Kettersbad was resolved. No heroic battles or flaming catapults, just a lot of raw sewage and fools who were too stupid not to crap in their own drinking water. Once the situation there got settled, I set about trying to figure out who exactly these armies represented and what they were trying to accomplish. It turned out that they were a mishmash of house troops from the surrounding lands, the odd mercenary company or three, and even a contingent of Arzuli who had gotten turned around and somehow ended up here. I couldn't discern any coherent plan amongst them, just a vague sense that they should all be here so that nobody else could claim the city. Their loyalty to the major factions in the Civil War changed by the hour and seemed contingent on whichever side they thought would let them get away with the most looting. Honestly, if we hadn't shown up, they probably would have started fighting amongst themselves and reduced the city to a smoking ruin. Once I figured out who the major nobles were, I politely suggested, with Minrir standing behind me, that they and a few servants accompany me to Admini so that we could start sorting out this mess. They readily agreed, practically falling over themselves in their haste to pledge loyalty to my cause, which was interesting because as far as I knew, I didn't actually have a cause behind the vague notion that we should all be as sanitary as possible and, maybe stop lighting everything on fire. When we left, we spent the next few weeks making good time down the trade road, rounding up pacifists and inviting any noble that we came across to join us in our march to Admini. And soon our army had quite a troop of these pampered would-be tyrants accompanying us. And I have never dealt with such a whining, self-centered group of useless wastes of air in my entire life. They complained about the heat if the sun was out, the dampness if it was raining, the cold if it was cloudy, and they generally made nuisances out of themselves at every opportunity and every turn. They drove me to distraction with their constant requests for various specialized food items, begging for rest stops, threatening to drool one another over imagined slights of one sort or another, or constantly asking how much further it was. At one point, I strongly considered dumping the lot of them into the nearest river, but luckily I hit on the idea of having them sort out what order they would enter Admini's gates in, assuming that we ever got there. And that kept them nicely occupied bickering amongst themselves for the rest of the trip. I did actually have to ask Kells to take an interest in a few of the more intransigent ones, but she handled it with her usual brutal if cheerful efficiency, and they quickly fell into line. We eventually arrived on the outskirts of Admini late one sunny afternoon, and I observed that the Beledian army was still encamped on the far side. Apparently, this meant that Prince Balric and the princess were still dating. I assumed so, but the mating rituals of young nobles eluded me, especially ones with access to large groups of armed men. They didn't seem inclined to engage in hostilities, at least, so I had our army make camp to allow the nobles to primp and preen for their big entrance the following morning. And I had just sat down on a log by my command tent and was removing my boots when a sentry walked up and informed me that I had a visitor. Gods, who now? I moaned. If it's another noble whining about how hard the ground is, I'm going to quit everything and go live amongst the ice fowl in the freezing north. Just then I heard a prim voice behind me say, "Well, that's a fine idea. You'll undoubtedly fit right in, what with your aquatic skills and well-known aversion to leopard seals." I spun around, and there she was, looking at me with her pale blue eyes. It was Cyrene. She was wearing a simple brown writing desk with a large leather satchel slung over her shoulder, her brown hair in a tight bun, and a small frown on her face. Um, Cyrene, what a surprise! What are you doing here? How are things in the capital? How did you get out here? Where are your guards? I like your hair. I winced at the last statement. But I always found myself a babbling, nervous wreck around her, and that was not the most ridiculous thing I've ever said to her, not by far. Things are fine in the city. The sewers are functioning well, and I got here on a horse. I don't need guards because I don't have time to get accosted by ruffians. She sniffed at the very idea. And truth be told, I didn't envy any hooligan who tried to stop her. To answer your first question, she continued, I'm here to tell you that Baron Hurganaz and Prince Dumesinian went south to confront the Gugaran hordes, and they've managed to get themselves and their armies massacred. The Grugaran have selected a high horde master on their way here to burn the city and engage in an unsustainable amount of pillaging and similar nonsense. So what I need you to do is take this army, go down there, and stop them. The Beledians, being the useless sorts that they are, have refused to help. And quite honestly, I've got more than enough to do here without dealing with unwashed nomads, too. She glanced down at my half-shod feet. So, put your boots back on and go get to it. With that, she strode off into the gathering dusk. I looked down at my dusty boots. Why do everyone else's problems always seem to turn into my problems? I asked them sadly. Is it too much to ask that I get a night off to read, relax, and have someone else sort these things out? But being leather and utterly lacking in vocal cords or any sort of higher brain functions, my boots didn't answer. So I groaned, put them back on, hoisted myself off of my comfortable log, and went to go find Minrir and Kells. Next morning, my army continued south to confront the Grugaran, a notoriously ill-tempered bunch who preferred horses to people and acted accordingly. Now, I didn't know much about them except from what I had read in various histories of nations that had been unfortunate enough to have encountered them and survived. But it was universally acknowledged that Grugaran were best dealt with from afar, not only due to their noxious hygiene habits, but also because they took an offense at nearly anything not horse-related. And given their almost non-existent communication skills, it wasn't surprising that they usually resolved cultural differences by shooting the other party full of arrows. And this, along with their stubborn refusal to learn anything from their past mistakes, made them undesirable neighbors, to say the least, because they regularly rampaged through the surrounding nations like the illiterate buffoons they so clearly were. The usual way to handle them was to evacuate the country folk to the nearest fortified town or castle, and then wait until the Grugaran got bored and meandered off. Sometimes they even took to squabbling amongst themselves. Sometime else, some other lucky person would manage to decipher what they wanted and pay them off. But what was emphatically not recommended was to meet them in open battle, because they were highly mobile and crack shots with the short compound bows they were so famous for. And yet, this is exactly what our two noble idiots had done. And not only that, they'd somehow managed to get the Grugarans so enraged that they'd undoubtedly be raiding for months before they settled down. And we couldn't have that, so Cyrene had rightfully decided we needed to crush them sooner rather than later, while there was still a harvest left unburnt in the fields. And it fell to us, as the only remaining kingdom army around Admini worthy of the title, to do just that. Lucky us. The only bright spot in this otherwise grim enterprise was that it provided me with the perfect excuse to ditch the noble hangers-on we had accumulated during our march. I left them milling around the gates of Admini, waving their ridiculous rapiers at each other and shrilly arguing about who had priority in their long-planned grand entrance into the city. I doubt even the arrival of the Grugaran would have put an end to that particular mess, so I was happy to leave them to it. We continued south uneventfully until, after about a week of steady marching through the fertile central plains of the kingdom, we met the notorious Grugaran horde on the shores of the Sun River. And what a horde it was! We smelled them first, of course, but only after the shouting, ragged mass of horsemen showed up and began milling around aimlessly did I truly begin to get a sense of what we were up against. Lots of them, I noted to Minrir as I sat astride Moose, watching the unwashed savages yelling gibberish at each other on the far side of the river. And they look upset. Minrir grunted in agreement, then ordered a nearby captain to have our troops set up our usual fortified camp. Well, at least they don't seem to have any silly tattoos, I said philosophically, so that's an improvement. Smell worse, though, Minrir noted as he absently scanned the opposing mob. There is that, I agreed. But maybe they'll clean up some when they charge across the river. Maybe, he replied, but I wouldn't count on it. That's the kind of smell that takes years to mature, so I don't think a quick dunk in a slow-moving river is going to do anything but kill some fish. He gestured at a small group of Grugarin who were separating from the horde and approaching the opposite bank. That must be the High Horde Master and his chieftains. Well, let's go see what they have to say. Maybe they'll surprise us and decide to be reasonable, I replied. With that fond hope, I gestured for Kells to join us, and we rode down to the riverbank. The High Horde Master was a tall, crazy-eyed man with matted black hair, wearing iron-studded leathers and wielding a Grugarin scimitar and horn shortbow. His entourage was similarly dressed, and I noticed a small, particularly evil-looking Minrir riding just behind the Horde Master, holding a strange-looking banner. It looked like a wooden pole with three crosspieces that had several round objects securely tied beneath each of them. Our respective parties stared at each other silently across the shallow river for a few moments, and then the negotiating began. And by negotiating, I mean the High Horde Master began shrieking threats and insults while his minion enthusiastically waved the odd banner behind him. I could barely understand what he was yelling about, something along the lines of how we were disrespectfully trying to fight instead of just letting them do whatever they wanted. Of course, the fact that they hadn't exactly told anyone what they wanted didn't seem to slow him down at all. He threw a few choice insults at Moose, too, asking how I could ride such an ugly demon-spawned abomination. And Moose looked affronted by that, and I couldn't really blame him. Anyway, I missed most of what he was saying because, quite frankly, the banner they were waving around so industriously was distracting. I'd never seen anything like it, so I studied it carefully as the Horde Master ranted and raved in the background. As I looked closer, I realized with astonishment that what I had initially taken for oddly shaped gourds tied to the crossbars were actually human heads. I turned to Minrir and whispered, correct me if I'm wrong, but are those heads tied to the crossbars of their war cross thingy? He squinted, then grunted in surprise. Huh, yeah, they certainly seem to be. I leaned back on Moose and rubbed my chin. I'd never heard of anyone, Gugarin or otherwise, who carried something like that around with them, and I found the entire concept of a head banner to be a bit confusing. I suppose it was intended to intimidate potential enemies by reminding them that they could end up decorating the same pole if they weren't careful. But this raised even more questions. How did they decide who involuntarily ended up decorating their head banner? Was it someone who was particularly troublesome? Or did they use some sort of lottery system? Or maybe they simply went with people who had the best looking heads. The more I studied the banner, the more bemused I became until I noticed something else. Hey, I nudged Minrir. Isn't that the Abbesse de Chartres? I pointed at one of the fresher heads tied on the bottom crossbar. He studied the head banner carefully, then exclaimed, It is! And look, there's the tax collector for the Duchy of Sudland. Well, I'll be, I said thoughtfully. I mean, there's old Dumasinian right there, and the fat head on the top right is clearly Huguenot's, but who are these other people? I can see using the heads of the opposing armies as decorations, but why add a tax collector and someone who ran a boarding school? It doesn't make any sense. You could ask them, Kells suggested brightly. I'll bet they'd be happy to tell us all about how they choose which people's heads to use on their nice pole. I think I will, I said, nodding to her. Then I raised my hand and started waving at the still shouting Horde Master. Yoo-hoo, I shouted. Can I interrupt for a moment? Thank you. I have a few questions for you. He had stopped mid-rant and stared at me in confusion. Clearly, he wasn't used to his future victims having the temerity to address him with anything besides screams and pleas for mercy, much less questions. Yes, thank you again, I said in the sudden silence. We'd actually like to know a bit more about your nice war cross thing. We couldn't help but notice that you have thoughtfully decorated it with several heads, and we had some questions about that. Can you answer those for us, please? They glanced at each other while their army milled about confusedly behind them. Then the horde master tentatively nodded. Outstanding, I said. So, we saw that you've got Baron Hurganaz and old Prince Dumessinian on in your collection, which is great and makes a lot of sense. Believe me, very intimidating and all that, Minrir snorted. But we also noticed that you've got Corbret, the tax collector for Sudland, and the Abbess de Chartres. Why did you include them? Corbret wasn't that important, even in Sudland, and the abbess was mainly known for being a foul-tempered harpy in charge of a small, overpriced boarding school. Could you please explain why you saw fit to include them? The head banner bobbed up and down, and I noticed the abbess had a particularly sour expression on her face. The horde milled about a bit more, and then the horde master roared, "We will add your heads to it if you're not careful." Yes, yes, I waved dismissively. We understand that. We're the leaders of this army, so it makes sense that we'd grace your little head banner if you decide to kill us. But what we don't understand is why you would include a glorified accountant and a headmistress. I think what would be helpful here is to tell us how you decide whose head to add. I can understand adding leaders, like I said before, but what other criteria do you use? Do you add strong fighters, people who are particularly annoying, or just somebody who has a head that you find particularly appealing? We're a bit confused by your head mounting procedures, and we hope that you can enlighten us. The Gugarin muttered amongst themselves, getting increasingly agitated until one of them finally yelled, "We add people who we really, really don't like." Yes, that stands to reason, I replied. But why don't you like them? There's got to be certain things that would make you say, "Yep, that's definitely headbanner material right there," right? We just want to get an idea of what those things are, is all. Minrir nudged me and pointed at yet another head bobbing on the second crossbar. I think that's the barkeep for that nice tavern in Sudland. The one with the world-famous tankard collection on the walls. And what is he doing there? I shouted, pointing at the barkeep. He was, by all accounts, a jovial fellow who just liked collecting tankards. That doesn't seem like a good reason to end up on a head banner, does it? The horde master stared at me for a long moment, and then he began shouting and waving his arms in a frenzy. Obviously, my questions had bewildered him, and rather than devote mental energy to self-examination, he was working himself up to charging over the river and removing the source of this confusion, namely me. Honestly, I doubt he even knew why he had a head banner in the first place. Maybe it was tradition? I don't know. I decided to ask him, "Why do you even have one?" I asked. "It's not intimidating us. In fact, all it's doing is confusing everyone." Kells poked my leg and whispered, "I don't think he has any idea why he has it." I bent down and replied, "Yeah, I think you're right. He seems very confused. I don't think he's the type who plans ahead too well, and I'm definitely sure he's not fond of self-reflection. I think things are about to get a bit dicey, sad to say." Kells looked at me solemnly and then nodded at my crossbow and held out her hand. Confused, I handed it down to her and asked, "What, do you not want to choke people anymore? I thought that was your signature, your thing, as it were." I looked at her suspiciously. "You're not going to do something rash, are you?" She just nodded distractedly, aimed, and shot the horde master in the side of his head, cutting him off mid-rant/arm wave. He looked outraged for a moment and then fell backwards off of his horse. There was a sudden silence. Sorry, I shouted, thinking fast. That was a misfire. I just gave my crossbow to Kells here, and, women, am I right? I shrugged helplessly. Kells smiled brightly and yelled, I'm sorry too. I forgot it was loaded. Silly me. And then she apologetically handed it back to me. The Gagarin nodded amongst themselves and muttered things like, I can't trust a woman to do anything but cook and clean, really, and never should let them near weaponry of any sort, or this sort of thing is bound to happen. And, in addition, my personal favorite, they're really only good for one thing, right? Accompanied with chortling and moronic snickers. It was obvious that the Gagarin were idiots, and that gave me an idea. I cleared my throat. Well, this is a bit awkward. I'll tell you what, in light of these recent tragic circumstances, which I can't help but feel somewhat responsible for, we'd like to make amends by paying you tribute. Would, say, a large amount of gold be appropriate? The Grugarin quickly forgot all about their late leader lying on the ground and eagerly nodded. I could practically feel the greed emanating from them as they envisioned us delivering wagon loads of gold in a vain attempt to convince them to raid elsewhere. Great, I said, clapping my hands. Well, let's just sort out amongst yourselves who your leader is, and we'll make the arrangements. The Gugarin horde let out an enthusiastic roar and began talking animatedly amongst themselves. The discussion went on for a while, getting increasingly loud and angry, and I noticed a marked increase in arm-waving scimitar rattling and general agitation. Minrir, Kells, and I watched silently while the yells turned to shoving, and the shoving to punching, until inevitably one hothead drew steel and cut some other hothead's head off. Moose's ears perked forward with interest as the entire Gugarin horde soon devolved into a swirling mass of screaming men and horses, wildly slashing at each other as they tried to sort out who was in charge. After a few minutes of this, I sighed with exasperation and said, well, this is going to go on for a bit, I'm afraid. Let's go get something to eat. Minrir and Kells agreed, and we returned to our fortified camp. We went to my recently erected command tent where I dismounted, stretched my aching back, and, with a relieved groan, sat down on a camp stool. I'm getting too old for this nonsense, I muttered as I gladly accepted the bowl of stew Kells handed me. No, you're not. You're just weak, Minrir noted as he strode off to supervise the emplacement of our ballistas. Kells giggled and plopped down next to me, crossing her legs and opening up a sketchbook to capture some of the more memorable scenes happening over the river. You are weak, Kells said, but you make up for it by being slightly less stupid than the rest of the people in charge. Thanks, I think. You're always such a ray of sunshine, I grumbled as I began shoveling the stew into my maw. I quickly polished it off and set aside my bowl. Negotiating is hungry work, isn't it? I asked Kells. She frowned at my bowl. So I groaned and got off my stool and picked it up and started scrubbing it out with a nearby rag. As I did, I realized that Moose was nowhere to be seen. That never boded well. Say, have you seen Moose around? I asked. Kells looked over at the Gugarin melee for a moment, then pointed. There he is. He's kicking that nice stallion. I looked, and sure enough, Moose was in the middle of the bloodbath, repeatedly and energetically kicking a huge, screaming Grugarin warhorse in the groin. I watched for a moment more, then said, I think it's a gelding now, and returned to cleaning my bowl. Moose trotted back to the tent after an hour or so, prancing in fine equine humor and bleeding from a few minor cuts and scratches. Well, I hope you had fun, I said sourly as I cleaned his wounds and brushed away the various Grugarin bits that were sticking in his mane. The least you could have done is rolled around in the river before coming back. You're a filthy mess, Moose, and you smell like Grugarin. He whinnied in amusement and then playfully bit me, trotting off as I swore loudly and rubbed my rapidly bruising shoulder. I really hated that horse. The melee continued into the next day, occasionally helped along when Kells shot any raider who looked like he might be starting to rally his fellows. Finally, After a few more hours, a battered, bruised, and bloody band of about 50 Grugaran survivors staggered to the riverbank and hailed us. The head banner, looking a bit worse for the wear, now had a few more additions, but again, I couldn't tell the difference between these newly added Grugaran heads and those that were still attached to the other 1,000 or so corpses that lay heaped in bloody mounds all along the south bank. Minrir, Kells, and I mounted up again and left our well-rested and entrenched army to go down and see what the surviving horse raiders had to say. So, I said briskly, have you sorted out who is in charge? A small band of Grugaran survivors milled around a bit, all of them wounded to some degree, clearly exhausted. We're all in charge, one of them finally said. We're a collective. A collective, I said. That's great. How are you going to decide who gets how much gold? We're all going to split it equally, another one replied. Everyone gets the exact same amount. Okay, that seems reasonable. Which one of you is going to divide it up? More uncomfortable milling ensued. Can you do it? One eventually asked. You seem like a trustworthy sort. I pondered for a moment, my chin on my fist, and then I abruptly came to a decision. No, I said. Let's do this instead. I turned and signaled my army, which had been waiting patiently for just this moment. They responded by firing every crossbow, ballista, catapult, and bow we had at the sadly diminished Grugaran. I even saw some of the camp followers throwing rocks and dirty linens at the hapless horsemen. That's how irritated everybody was. The small band of raiders didn't have time to do anything but look astonished before they were turned into non-mobile human porcupine hybrids. And then it was over. We packed up, cleaned up our camp, and marched back to Admini. We left the head banner stuck in the ground. Maybe someone would happen upon it and then let the rest of us know why certain people graced it, wherein so many others did not. And thus ended the great and bloody battle of Sun River. And that's that. Next chapter, they'll be going back to Admini and figuring out who's going to be governing the kingdom. And I'll have some interesting thoughts on governance of human societies if you're interested in that at the end of the episode. But with this one, I will have to say one thing. First off, touch a little bit on the whole series, the sewer thing in Kenner's Bad. I really do believe that the best way to see if you've got a healthy society, one that's well led, is by looking at the infrastructure. If it's got good infrastructure, it's probably a well governed political entity, whether it be a town or whatever. If it doesn't, it most likely isn't. And again, the reason for that is people that get into leadership because they like the flash don't tend to devote a lot of their attention to building sewer systems, even though they're very important. Um, Second thing, and this is nothing political, is that in reading through this, I have to really stop myself from going back and doing like one more edit of this. There's a lot of things I want to change as far as verbiage and stuff like that. But it was my first book, so it's a learning experience. Hopefully, I'm getting better at it. So I'm going to stop it there, and I will talk to you all next in the next episode, whenever that happens to be. Oops.